In the scorched wastelands of Iron Mesa, where law bends to greed and mercy, is a stranger. One rancher, scarred by war, stumbles upon two sisters, left to die in the wreckage of a burning wagon. His decision to save them is no simple act of kindness. It is the spark of a storm. Ruthless men will come, a corrupt sheriff will ride, and blood will mark the land. Yet from that fire something greater will rise, a fight for dignity, a chance for redemption, and the fragile hope of a new beginning. The desert has a way of swallowing things, whole wagon tracks, bones, and men's names alike. In southern Arizona, the sun doesn't just beat down. It scours, burning the skin until it blisters, baking the ground, until even rattlesnakes think twice before crossing it. Out here, the distance between one waterhole and the next can mean the difference between life and a shallow grave. It was in this place, where law bent more often than it stood, that Gideon Hale rode alone, with little more than a worn saddle, a haunted past, and a heart that had forgotten what it was to hope. The year was 1881, and the territory had become a battleground not just of guns, but of greed. Prospectors carved into the earth like carrion birds, digging for silver veins while leaving dust and blood behind. Land barons ruled with fists of iron, while sheriffs traded badges for bribes. It was a time when decency didn't just struggle to survive, it barely had the strength to crawl. Gideon Hale was no stranger to violence. A veteran of the frontier wars, he carried scars on his body and worse on his soul. His wife and daughter had been taken from him years before by a fever he could not fight, and since then his ranch at Cedar Hollow had become little more than a husk, a few hundred acres fenced in by silence. Each sunrise brought the same rhythm: mend a gatewater, the stock drink, a bitter cup of coffee, and remind himself that he was still breathing, though for no reason he could name. He lived because the land had not yet claimed him. That changed on an October afternoon near Iron Mesa. Dust had turned the sky the color of old brass, and the heat shimmered in waves along the horizon. Gideon came upon a broken supply wagon tipped into a gully. Its wheels were shattered, its crates burned. Arrows jutted from the wood like warning signs. The driver was slumped over the bench, long gone. But the wagon was not empty. Inside, bound hand and foot, were two young women. Their clothes were torn, their wrists rubbed raw from rope. Their eyes, though, were not vacant. One, the younger, barely 18, met his gaze with quiet desperation. The other, older by a handful of years, locked onto him with the fire of a hawk, cornered but unbroken. They were Apache, that much was clear, and from the way the wagon had been rigged, they had been cargo chattel to be sold, worked, or worse. Their captors were nowhere in sight. Perhaps spooked by gunfire in the distance, perhaps planning to return. Gideon knew he had moments, not hours, to decide. The smarter choice would have been to turn his horse and ride on. A man alone had no business interfering in the business of cutthroats and slavers. He had spent years teaching himself not to care, not to take on fights that weren't his. But then the younger one whispered a single word through cracked lips: water. It was a sound Gideon had heard once before, when his little girl lay dying in his arms, her breath too shallow to save. That memory struck him like a bullet, and he realized with sudden clarity that this was no accident. The desert had set him a choice right away, and let history repeat itself or draw a line in the sand that even death would not erase. He cut the ropes. And in that moment, Gideon Hale's lonely life ended, and another story, one of fire fury and fragile redemption, began. The desert kept its secrets in silence, burying them beneath heat and dust, until no one cared to look closer. Gideon Hale had learned long ago that the land was crueler than most men, though not by much. Riding south along the Iron Mesa Trail, he had been counting fence posts in his head to keep from thinking too hard when a thin column of smoke broke the horizon. At first he thought it was just another campfire, harmless against the vast sky, But the closer he came, the more he smelled what lingered on the wind, gunpowder sweat and something darker. The wreck of a supply wagon lay tilted in the arroyo, one wheel shattered canvas torn. Buzzards circled above their shadows, crossing the sand like omens. Gideon slowed his horse, his rifle ready, though nothing stirred but the whisper of heat. The driver was sprawled in the dust, a bullet hole neat in his temple. But it wasn't the corpse that held Gideon's eyes. It was the faint sound beneath the wagon canvas, a muffled cry, weak but alive. He dismounted and drew back the torn flap. Inside, 2 young women lay, bound wrists rubbed raw from rope. Their dark hair clung to sweat-slicked cheeks, their clothes little more than rags torn by struggle and travel. The older of the 2 had her chin lifted despite the bruises on her face, her eyes fierce even in exhaustion. The younger clung to her sister's arm, silent, but trembling, her gaze darting toward Gideon like a trapped bird measuring the size of its cage. They were Apache. He saw it instantly in their features, their braids, the quiet dignity they carried even in chains. He also knew what that meant in a place like this. Most white men would leave them, or worse. But Gideon wasn't most men. He had been a soldier once, fighting under a flag he no longer saluted. He had seen too many wagons just like this, too many innocents crushed between greed and hatred, and too many nights he woke to faces he couldn't forget. Easy now, he said, his voice low, steady, though his chest burned. He cut the ropes with his knife first, the elder, then the younger. The elder flexed her wrists, wincing, but refusing to show weakness. "Who did this?" Gideon asked. Her reply came after a long pause. "Men who trade in flesh. They will come back." Her English was sharp, deliberate, as though every word had been carved with care. Gideon nodded grimly. He glanced at the dead driver, at the scattered crates, tools, dried beans, a broken crate of whiskey bottles. Whoever had attacked meant to take the cargo, and the women were part of it. The raiders would not be gone long. "You've got 2 choices," Gideon said, standing back to give them space. "Stay here and pray those men don't return or ride with me. I don't promise safety, but I'll see you fed and I'll see you treated as human." The younger sister's lips parted as if to speak, but fear swallowed the sound. The elder stepped forward, standing between her sibling and Gideon, as though daring him to break his word. "Why?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "Because I didn't once," Gideon said quietly, "and I won't make the same mistake again." The words seemed to hang in the desert air, heavier than the sun itself. The elder studied him, searching his face for deceit, her suspicion battling with exhaustion. Finally, she nodded once. "Her name is Celine," she said, resting her hand on her sister's shoulder. "Mine is Naomi." Gideon tipped his hat. "Then let's move, Naomi." "Celine, we've got a long trail ahead." He lifted them one at a time onto his horse, then led the reins on foot, glancing often at the horizon. His instincts, sharpened by war and years of solitude, told him the raiders would return for their lost cargo. But as the wagon wreck disappeared behind them, he knew he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. By dusk, they reached the foothills where the land began to fold into shadowed canyons. Gideon found a sheltered hollow, built a small fire, and gave them water from his canteen. Celine drank greedily, though Naomi only sipped her eyes, never leaving him. Trust was a distant thing, and he didn't blame her. As night settled, Gideon sat with his rifle across his knees, listening to coyotes in the distance. He had no illusions. This was only the beginning. Taking them meant trouble. Men who sold women like cattle didn't forgive theft. And yet, for the first time in years, Gideon felt a weight shift inside him. Not the crushing burden of loss, but the fragile stirring of purpose. He glanced at the sisters curled near the fire, one watchful one already asleep. Perhaps they would never thank him. Perhaps they would leave the first chance they got. But he had made a choice, and in this country where choices shaped everything that was enough, the trail to Gideon Hale's homestead was not long in distance, but in silence it stretched like a lifetime. The sisters rode behind him on the bay mare, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of the horse, but their eyes fixed on the horizon, as though measuring the chance of escape. Gideon spoke little. Words had never been his strength. He had learned in war that silence could be armor, yet with every mile he felt that armor press heavier against his ribs. By the time the ridge opened into his valley, the light had thinned into copper dusk. Below lay the remnants of Hale's place, a weather-beaten house, crouched against a line of cottonwoods fences, slanting corrals in need of mending. Once, years ago, laughter had filled those walls. His wife Clara had planted lilacs by the porch and filled the air with music from a battered fiddle. All of that had ended in a cruel spring fever that took her in 3 days. Since then, the lilacs had withered. The fiddle lay silent, and the ranch had echoed with nothing but the creak of wood and the mutter of wind. Now Gideon found himself leading 2 strangers, 2 reminders of every ghost he carried into that hollow. On the porch, a figure waited, Isabel Cortez, his longtime housekeeper, and the only one stubborn enough to remain after Clara's death. Her apron was dusted with flour, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She squinted at the trio as they dismounted, her brows knitting into a single sharp line. "Senor Hale," she said, voice clipped, "what have you dragged home this time?" "Not dragged," Gideon replied evenly, helping the younger sister down. "Rescued." Isabel's eyes shifted to the sisters. Naomi held her chin high, unflinching, while Celine tucked herself close, half-hidden behind her sibling's arm. Isabel muttered something in Spanish under her breath that Gideon didn't quite catch, though he guessed it was a prayer mixed with warning. "They'll need food and water," Gideon added, "and a place to rest." Isabel's lips pressed thin, but she stepped aside. "Then bring them in, though don't think I won't ask questions later." Inside the house smelled of bread and wood smoke with the faint tang of leather oil from Gideon's tack spread near the hearth. The women hesitated just past the doorway, their shoulders stiff, their eyes darting from wall to wall as though waiting for hidden chains. Gideon poured water into tin cups and set them on the table. Naomi accepted hers without thanks, sipping cautiously while Celine drank, until Isabel gently took the cup from her hand. They ate in silence, save for the scrape of spoons and the tick of the clock. Gideon sat opposite, hands clasped, watching the shadows flicker across their faces. He felt every inch the intruder in his own home. After the meal, he showed them to the spare rooms upstairs. "These doors have locks on the inside," he said. "If you want them, use them. No one here will stop you." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "Why give us knives and locks? Men don't offer such things without reason." Gideon leaned against the doorframe, tired to the marrow. "Because you deserve the choice. That's reason enough." She studied him for a long breath, then closed the door without answering. That night, the house was no longer silent. The floorboards groaned with unfamiliar footsteps. Faint whispers in Apache drifted down the stairwell. Gideon sat alone at the fire, a glass of rye untouched in his hand, listening. He thought of the wagon wreck, of Celine's cracked lips whispering for water, of Naomi's eyes daring him to betray them. He remembered Clara's laughter and the ache that followed it, and for the first time in years, he felt something shift, not relief, not joy, but possibility. Morning came brittle and cold. Gideon was in the barn repairing a broken stall when Naomi appeared. She wore one of Isabel's old dresses that hung stiffly on her frame, and she carried herself with attention that reminded him of a hawk perched on a fence post ready to strike or to flee. You fought soldiers once? She said flatly. I did. Gideon admitted, tightening a nail. Against my people. He let the hammer rest his shoulders, sagging. Yes. Her voice cut sharp as flint. How many did you kill? Gideon swallowed hard. The truth was a number he had long stopped counting, a number that haunted his nights. Too many, he said softly. More than I'll ever atone for. Naomi's jaw tightened. So why save us? Because the world doesn't need another coward who looks away. Gideon answered, his gaze steady. I've done that before. I won't again. For a moment, neither moved. The horses shifted in their stalls, the smell of hay heavy in the air. Finally, Naomi nodded once, small, reluctant, but real. Later that evening, she did not eat across from him. She sat beside him. It was no miracle, no sudden forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Word traveled in the desert faster than wind. It wasn't long before Gideon Hale's quiet ranch found itself beneath the weight of whispers. By the second week, Isabel Cortez returned from town with her arms full of flour and her mouth set tight. She didn't have to speak for Gideon to know what she had heard. He saw it in the way she avoided the sisters' eyes, in the way her rosary clinked faster against her apron strings. People are talking, she said at last, unloading her basket onto the table. About 2 Apache women seen riding your horse. About how you didn't turn them over. Gideon rubbed the bridge of his nose. Let them talk. But it was never that simple in Asheville. Men here liked their order neat, their lines of power unchallenged. A rancher who harbored 2 women from a tribe they called enemy unsettled those lines, and men who felt unsettled tended to sharpen their knives. It began subtly. Neighbors stopped waving on the trail. The blacksmith refused to shoe Gideon's mare, claiming he was overworked. Prices at the general store crept higher. Naomi noticed it first, her hawk-like eyes catching the muttered curses, the lingering stares. Your people, she said one evening, do not hide their hatred well. They're not my people, Gideon answered, stacking firewood. Then whose are they? She pressed. He didn't answer. The storm broke one gray morning when the riders came. Gideon was mending a fence post along the southern pasture when he heard the clatter of hooves. 4 men rode hard into his yard, dust pluming at their heels. At their head was Cassius Crow, the same trader whose wagons Gideon had found wrecked weeks earlier. His black coat snapped like wings as he reined in his smile, sharp as broken glass. Well, well, Crow drawled, scanning the yard. Thought I'd find my property here. Gideon straightened slowly, resting one hand on the fence rail. Nothing here belongs to you. Crow chuckled, though there was no humor in it. You've got nerve, Hale. Those girls you stole worth more than cattle in the markets south of the border. You think you can just pluck them out of my hands and set 'em pretty in calico dresses? Naomi stepped out onto the porch, then Celine a step behind her. She carried herself tall knife at her belt braid, tight against her shoulder. Crow's grin widened. There they are, he said. Fiery one and quiet one. I'll take them back now, and maybe I'll be kind enough to leave you breathing. Try it, Naomi snapped. Her voice rang hard against the stillness. Gideon raised his hand slightly toward her, not to silence, but to steady. Then he turned to Crow. You come onto my land, threaten women under my roof, and expect me to fold. You've mistaken me for a man who hasn't buried worse than you. Crow's eyes narrowed. His men shifted in their saddles, fingers brushing the butts of pistols. The air thickened, waiting for the spark. It was Isabel who broke it. She stepped from the doorway with a shotgun braced against her hip, her gray hair loose around her shoulders. Señores, she called her Spanish lilt, cutting through the yard. I've fed this family for 20 years. I'll be damned before you dirty it. Celine, trembling but fierce, moved to stand beside Naomi. For the first time, Gideon saw the sisters not as broken survivors, but as flames, one bright and sharp, the other steady and warm, burning against the men who would snuff them out. Crow sneered. "You think you can build a wall of women around you? Hail won't last. This land doesn't forget. Apache blood don't mix with white men's dirt." "You're right," Gideon said, voice low as thunder. "This land doesn't forget. It remembers every sin men like you carve into it. And someday it demands a reckoning." Crow's smirk faltered. For a long moment no one moved. Then he spat into the dust, jerked his reins, and turned his horse. "This ain't over," he called over his shoulder. "The desert's patient, and so am I." The riders thundered off, leaving silence so thick Gideon could hear Celine's ragged breath. Naomi lowered her knife but kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if expecting Crow to turn back. Inside, Isabel muttered prayers while putting the shotgun away. Gideon poured water for the sisters, his own hand steady only by habit. "You didn't have to stand out there," he said to Naomi. "Yes, I did," she replied. "If I hide, he wins. If I speak, he sees I am not broken." Her words carved deep into Gideon's chest. He had lived years half hidden in grief, a ghost of a man. Yet these sisters, who had every reason to vanish into shadow, chose instead to stand visible in defiance. That night, the ranch was restless. The wind rattled the shutters, the coyotes howled too close, and Gideon found himself checking the rifle more than once. He knew Crow would return. Men like him always did. But something had changed. It was no longer just about protection. It was about dignity. And Gideon Hale, for the first time in years, felt he had something worth fighting for. The days after Cassius Crow's visit moved with a different weight. The yard no longer echoed with the aimless solitude Gideon Hale had lived in for years. Instead, every dawn carried the thrum of footsteps, voices, and the scrape of new labor. Trouble still prowled the horizon, yes, but so did something else. Something Gideon had nearly forgotten how to name. Naomi and Celine did not remain as shadows in the house. Naomi rose before the sun, moving through the barn with a sharpness that surprised Gideon. She knew horses knew the way to calm a nervous mare with the brush of her hand, knew how to repair a latch with nothing but a strip of wire. She worked without waiting to be told, but always with her knife tucked at her hip, a reminder that her trust had limits. Celine drifted toward quieter spaces, the kitchen, the garden beds that Clara had once planted, the little alcove by the creek where cottonwoods threw cool shade. Isabel Cortez took to her almost against her will, scolding. When Celine burned bread, muttering. When she sang too loudly, but softening all the same. For Gideon, the change was like waking into a house that breathed again. Where once silence had pressed on him like stone, now the rooms hummed with small signs of life. Naomi sharpening tools by the window. Celine's low song in the garden. Isabel lecturing in Spanish about onions and patience. At first, Gideon kept his distance, unsure if his presence would taint what they were building. But slowly the rhythm drew him in. One evening, while repairing a gatepost together, Naomi broke the silence. "Your land is wide," she said, testing the wood with her palm. "Too wide for 3 people to hold." "4," Gideon corrected, nodding toward Isabel in the distance. Naomi's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. 4, still not enough. Gideon set his hammer down. "What are you saying?" "That others wander too," she replied. "Families. Broken children without fathers. Women without safe walls. If there is land here that can hold them, why keep it only for yourself?" Her words dug into him like spurs. He thought of the grave on the hill where Clara rested, of all the years he had guarded this place, like a tomb instead of a home. Clara would have wanted the gates open, not shut. Gideon felt the truth of that burn hot in his chest. Then we'll build for more, he said at last. And so they did. The work was hard, but it came with a sense of purpose that steadied them. Gideon felled timber from the ridge. Naomi measured ground for cabins. Isabel kept meals warm, even as she muttered that men were fools for expanding trouble. Celine tended a new patch of earth near the creek, planting herbs she remembered from her mother's teachings, arranging them in circles like sunwheels. By midsummer, the land itself seemed to shift no longer a monument to sorrow, but a place alive with sweat laughter and the faint sound of hammer on nail. Yet for all the labor, it was the evenings that marked the true change. Around the fire, Celine would sing in Apache, her voice low and haunting, and Naomi would sometimes translate the words for Gideon. They were not songs of war, but of rivers hawks and journeys home. Gideon rarely spoke, but he listened in a way he had not listened to anything in years. Naomi noticed. One night after Celine had gone to bed, and Isabel busied herself with washing pots, Naomi lingered on the porch. The air smelled of mesquite smoke, and the stars burned sharp against the dark. Gideon leaned against the post arms crossed, watching the land settle into quiet. "You carry ghosts," Naomi said softly. "So do you," Gideon answered. She studied him, the firelight catching her eyes. "The difference is, mine still walk the earth. Yours stay in the ground." He swallowed throat tight. "Doesn't make them lighter." "No," she admitted. Then, after a long pause, "But maybe they don't have to bury you too." It was the closest either had come to acknowledging the thread pulling them together, not desire in the loud, consuming sense, but something steadier forged through shared silence, through choosing to stay when running might have been easier. In the weeks that followed, word of the ranch's shift began to spread. A boy with a limp appeared first, leading a stray dog, then a widow with 2 children, their eyes wide with hunger. Gideon did not ask for their names or their debts. He simply pointed to the half-built cabin and said, "Help us finish it, and it's yours." More came an old man with stories no one believed a woman who had fled a mining camp with nothing but the clothes on her back. The land filled with voices, with faces, with new chances. Crow's threats still lingered shadows on the horizon, but Gideon found he no longer carried them alone. Each dawn, he looked across his land and saw Naomi walking the fences, Celine teaching children to weave flowers into their hair, Isabel cursing at the chickens. And for the first time since Clara's grave went cold, Gideon Hale felt not like a man keeping watch over ruins, but like one standing in the middle of something just beginning. Autumn swept down from the high country with winds sharp enough to rattle shutters and drive geese south across the pale sky. The work on Hale's ranch did not slow with the season. If anything, the urgency deepened. Cabins now stood along the ridge like watchful sentries, smoke rising from their chimneys. Chickens scratched in pens. Children chased dogs across the yard, and the evenings filled with fireside stories told in both English and Apache. What had begun as Gideon Hale's lonely refuge was no longer his alone. It had become a place where the discarded found room to breathe. But peace never lasted long in a land that thrived on division. Cassius Crow had not forgotten. His men skulked along the outer trails, leaving broken fence posts, shot cattle, and once a warning nailed to the gate a hawk's wing severed and bloodied. Fear rippled through the new families, yet Naomi stood unshaken. "He wants us to run," she said, holding the feather in her palm. "So we stay." It was Celine who spoke of ceremony. One cool evening she sat by the fire braiding grass into thin cords while children watched. "If people come here to start again," she said, "then they must see it with their own eyes. See that this is not Gideon's land alone, not a hiding place but something chosen, and they must see you two stand side by side." Her words carried through the group like smoke clinging and undeniable. Gideon shifted uncomfortably, but Naomi did not flinch. "She is right," Naomi said simply. her voice steady. So it was decided not with fanfare, but with quiet certainty. Gideon Hale and Naomi Skyhawk would bind their lives, not as possession, not as bargain, but as promise. Preparations unfolded in the most practical of ways. Isabel commandeered the kitchen, grumbling about flour shortages even as she baked bread for 3 dozen mouths. Celine stitched a dress from buckskin, sewing turquoise beads along the hem that caught the light like drops of water. Gideon had nothing fine to wear. Naomi told him not to bother. A man's worth, she said, is not in the coat on his back, but the calluses on his hands. The ceremony took place beneath the old cottonwood by the creek, its branches bare but strong against the autumn sky. Families gathered in a wide circle, children holding candles in tin cups, elders offering words in Spanish, English, and Apache. Gideon stood awkwardly at first, boots worn, vest patched, but Naomi's presence steadied him. She wore her mother's feather in her braid, the beads glinting at her hem, her chin lifted in defiance of every man who had ever tried to break her. There were no papers signed, no preacher's sermon. Instead, the vows came in their own words. Naomi spoke first. "I have walked through fire, and I am still here. I do not need a man to save me, but I choose one who does not ask me to bow. I choose you." Gideon swallowed hard, his voice rough. "I have buried too much to believe in second chances, yet you stand before me not as forgiveness, but as proof that I can still build something worth keeping. I choose you." Celine stepped forward, then placing the braided cord of grass into their joined hands. She tied it gently, knot by knot, while murmuring a prayer only half of them understood. When she finished, she looked up, tears bright in her eyes. "Now you are not alone," she whispered. The people cheered not loud but full, a sound that rose with the wind and seemed to settle into the land itself. Isabel wept into her apron, though she denied it, claiming the smoke from the fire was to blame. That night, the ranch glowed with more than firelight. Songs rose in different tongues, drums beaten on barrels, laughter rolling across the valley. Gideon watched Naomi move among the people, her hand brushing Celine's shoulder, her voice low with the women, her smile rare but unbreakable. She was not a guest anymore, not a shadow to be pitied. She was anchor, guardian, partner. Later, when the fires burned low and the stars stretched wide, Gideon and Naomi stood at the edge of the bluff. Below them, the cabins flickered with the lights of new beginnings. Gideon slipped his roughened hand into hers, not out of claim, but of choice. She did not pull away. Crow's threats had not vanished. They lingered like wolves in the dark. But Gideon understood something now. This was no longer just about him, or about the sisters he had rescued from a wagon wreck weeks ago. It was about every soul who had stepped across his threshold with nothing but fear in their pockets and found enough courage to stay. The cottonwood rustled the wind, carrying their voices down into the valley. And Gideon Hale, once a man of silence and ghosts, felt his chest ease for the first time in years. Whatever storms came, they would not face them apart. Winter pressed hard against the valley, but the cabins of Hale's land glowed with warmth. Smoke curled from chimneys, and laughter slipped through the cold air, carried farther than Gideon Hale ever imagined possible. The man who once lived with only silence and ghosts now woke each morning to the clatter of pans in Isabel's kitchen, the chatter of children feeding chickens, and Celine's clear voice teaching letters on a slate board propped against the porch rail. The world had changed not in thunderclaps, but in the steady rhythm of life shared. Crow came back once in the dead of January. His men crept near the fence line under moonlight, hoping to burn the barns, maybe scatter the people who had gathered here. But they were met not with fear, but with resolve. Naomi stood at the gate with her knife at her side, Gideon at her shoulder, Isabel wielding her shotgun, and half a dozen settlers with torches ready. Crow lingered at the edge of the firelight, saw not just two sisters, but an entire community, and realized the land was no longer his to bully. He cursed, spat into the snow, and rode into the darkness. After that night, no one doubted the ranch's purpose. It wasn't Gideon's alone, and it wasn't a refuge held together by pity. It was something larger. Cedar Hollow, they began to call it, a place where no one was asked to prove their worth before stepping across the threshold. You came as you were scarred or lost, and you stayed because others chose to see you. The seasons turned as they always did. Spring brought green shoots to the valley and fresh calves in the pasture. Summer brought long days of mending fences and tending gardens. Children grew bold in the creek, splashing until Isabel shouted them dry, while Celine carved a circle of stones for songs and prayers. Gideon watched it all unfold with a quiet awe. He had spent years trying to bury himself beneath grief, but here, amid hammer strikes and harvests, the murmur of Apache songs beside the crackle of Spanish lullabies, he felt something unshakable take root. At dusk, he often found Naomi walking the fence line, her shadow long in the fading light. Sometimes she said nothing. Other times she spoke of dreams of teaching girls to defend themselves, of planting orchards by the ridge, of opening their gates to anyone who had been told no too many times. Gideon listened the way a man listens when every word is a reminder that life is not over. He never promised her easy days, but he stood ready at her side, and she knew it. Years later, travelers passing through spoke of the valley with something close to reverence. They said there was a place where the forgotten had built a town out of nothing, where a rancher with sorrow in his bones and a woman with fire in her eyes had stood together and said enough. And when Gideon sat on the porch in the evenings, Naomi beside him, Celine laughing with children who weren't hers, but called her sister anyway, Isabel humming as she kneaded bread inside, he understood. This was the redemption he hadn't dared hope for. Not absolution for the blood on his hands, but the chance to make something better than what had come before. The land had once been barren with grief. Now it rang with voices, with trust, with stubborn, ordinary joy. And in that quiet, hard-earned chorus, Gideon Hale no longer felt alone. He had chosen, and been chosen in return. The desert remembered, yes, but so did they. If stories of redemption, quiet courage, and hard-won love stir your heart, subscribe to Frontier Reveries Whispers of the West. Every tale carries you deeper into the soul of the frontier, where broken people find home and silence blooms into hope. Don't miss the next story. Subscribe today and ride with us.